for having me, Senator, and committee. It's nice to be back here. 25 years ago last week, I was nominated to the Public Utility Commission by Governor Bush, who told me, Pat, the utilities care more about what we think, pointing to House, Senate, and himself, than what their customers think, and that's wrong, and we're going to change that. And so right then at the time, and I think Senator Zaffarine was actually on the nominating committee that confirmed me, so thank you for that. I'm back.
How many years ago was that?
25. Senator Witt.
Just saying.
She looks radiant. Senator Whitmire is here as well.
Not here now.
Not here now. He's going to have a hard time. I think you've had quite a few in the years since I was here. We had legislation that session from the legislature to open up the wholesale market, to basically acknowledge that utilities, that generation was a competitive entity and utilities did not need to be in it. 4 years later, same recognition that retail sales were not a natural monopoly, and utilities didn't need to have a monopoly franchise on that. We did carve out co-ops and munis for political reasons, but as far as the economic, we also delayed the implementation of competition to the corners of Texas that were subject to federal jurisdiction because their wholesale markets were not at the level that ERCOT was. So when I left in 2001 to go with Governor Bush to chair the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, that was really one of our charges, was to get competitive markets at the wholesale level that looked like ERCOT everywhere in the nation. We got about 2/3 of it done, but importantly, we got the parts that are attached to Texas done, except for El Paso. I think it's always helpful to look at numbers. I think one of the earlier witnesses said that, and I'm handing around, our clerk's handing around this chart here. I got 4 little slides, but this was the rate that I would have paid as a HLMP customer on the last day of regulation in Texas. That was about 10.5 cents. As you see, the bulk of that was generation, the blue color. Flip the page. This is my rate last year. I have my retailer is a competitive retailer that passes through the wholesale cost to me. I do get to use all these things. I have solar panels. I drive an EV. I have a battery in my garage. So I get to play the geek stuff, but I'm trying this stuff out to see if it really works, and yes, it does. This is 7.5 cents. Adjusted for inflation, that means my rate went down by half. Even without adjusting for inflation, it dropped by a quarter. The little arrow there points to where basically the savings are. As you'll see, the wires went up. What happened? If you'll flip the page, where did this bucket of savings come from? I get asked this all the time. Other states have finally crawled back out of the cave now and are thinking about it because they see what's going on here, and they want it too, as they should. And obviously the answers are kind of varied, but these are the 3 buckets I've really focused on in the analysis of what we did right. But one was getting power plants into an efficient marketplace. If you can't pass the buck on for running it wrong, or for running it at the wrong hour, or for procuring fuel that's too expensive, or hardware that's not cost effective, then you shut down, or you go find somewhere else to make money. So the most efficient power plants are the ones that have to bear the cost of their good and bad decisions. They get the rewards when things are good. Lower profit margins. Chairman Walker and the commissioners are here. They know how it is. We as regulators had to decide what was the appropriate profit margin to encourage this activity. So we would set rates based on a complex formula or a dartboard or something in between. And so we would set those rates relatively high. We'll just say that based on the competitive markets, and I was chairman of independent producer Dynegy before it merged with Vistra last year, we were very happy to get a 3% return on equity, not the 14% pre-tax return or 10% after-tax return that we would set for the utilities. So the competitive profit margins are tight. You hear from the competitors here, that it's so important to this market and the signals are right, and that's true because the margins on which they can earn money and pay dividends to their shareholders is much tighter here than it is for a utility. And the third bullet is one you heard beautifully from the earlier panel, but I'll reemphasize it because it is our silver bullet. Excess cost of capacity is borne by the market. One of the victories here is that we put the risk of excess capacity of former utility investment decisions on the backs They've been on the backs of captive customers for a century. We stopped that. We said we're putting that investment risk on the companies who know how to manage the risk, and we're making them bear the risk. Some of them have gone bankrupt. Some of them have made good money. A lot of them are right somewhere in between, and they're healthy companies that are providing power on the grid today. That's how it should work. That's what we wanted. And I put in parentheses the $7 billion CREZ investment, which was referred to. It is the largest utility transmission project in U.S. history. Was done to beef up our central and western grids back in 2006 to 2013, that time frame. It was a significant contributor, but it also caused the price to go up. So that's why I had it as a credit to the savings power. The last page is, where is this all going? I don't think this is 80 years from now, because we're doing a lot of it now. You heard from the last panel beautifully about the demand response issue from Bill on down. The response, and I saw Senator Nichols, you honing in on that. That issue is something I didn't have when I was in Deanne spot. We didn't have the ability to think that a price signal would transmit to customers, and whether they're like me, the geeks that are shutting off the HVAC on the day that Bill Magnus talked about, my HVACs were off. They went down. They had an automatic signal that got the ERCOT price signal, and it told the 4 air conditioners shut off. Now, after about 3 hours, I got a phone call from Mrs. Wood, and that was kind of a different conversation. But for those first 3 hours, we were doing fine on the financial front at the Woodhouse.
It won't shut off.
But the demand response issue is what we didn't have. And as a regulator, that's why really regulators exist for a number of purposes, but it's to stop market power. If the market can monitor and address itself, we have won. So that's a big victory. You talk about nuclear, it's not cost effective today, but the innovations going on in the modular, small nuclear, like the kind you could put at Fort Hood, or that's really where some of the draw is coming from. It was driven in both the Bush and Obama administrations by a desire to have a standalone kind of ability to do their own deal, military bases. The modular nuclears have always been there. So it's not cost effective yet. The old nuclear technology is way out of market on price, but I think that's going to be a big part of the grid of the futures, and it's not here. The other things are here. Wind, solar, real-time demand response, storage, as we hear coming on here. I'm involved in a similar company effort, as Josh was talking about. EVs, big part. Obviously bigger cars than just the ones we're talking about, but all that's here. That is the world we're preparing for. I can't think of a better market than the one that we set up and that you all are stewarding and doing a much better job than I ever could have in keeping it forward. Again, the ways to keep it there, to keep that investment there, are always remind people, and I don't hear it from you, I don't hear it from our governors, that the customer is paramount. And it shouldn't just be the customers who are lucky enough to live in ERCOT IOU service territories either, I should add. And I think Mr. Shorter and I would obviously agree on those issues. But continue to ring fence the monopoly. We did a great job of saying you do regulated wires business and you don't participate in the market. And keep those mandatory charges that are coming up, kind of keep them down. I think the commission's got plenty of authority to do that. Beautiful. Keep that big old welcome mat out for technology, for innovation, for new business models, the kind of things that you hear about. I'm thrilled you're asking those questions in the quiet of the interim, because those sometimes get lost. But that is really what our state has got a great reputation for in this industry and many other industries as well. But having that welcome mat where we just crush barriers to entry, we let new ideas flourish. I'm involved in this battery working group at ERCOT that has been very open to new ideas and very action focused on getting things fixed so that businesses can come in here and do what we all want them to do. So I think that's great. Getting the distribution utilities, again, we have ERCOTs over the transmission utilities, because the transmission utilities were the ones who were kind of taking it slow on hooking up the Calpines of the world who wanted to come build new gas-fired plants here in the 90s. Now that arena has now moved down to a smaller level, so it's more local now, behind the substation with the distribution utilities. We don't have an ERCOT there that kind of caused the balls and strikes for all this stuff. It is individual negotiations between battery developers and storage developers and the individual distribution utilities. and we'll just see how that plays out. I mean, I think so far so good, but it's all new to everybody. We're all kind of figuring that out. But that welcome mat, it just more broadly is important. And finally, I've just got to say, this is the only state. When I look at kind of how this energy agenda started in a very bipartisan manner back in 95 and 99, continued through major legislation in 05 as well. That bipartisan, stable regulatory environment has been a gold mine for us, because investors know they can come here, as you've heard from this panel and the early ones, they can come here, make a business plan, and know that it's not going to be disrupted by the kind of things we see going on at the federal level. So thank you for that, and thanks for keeping faith with this pro-customer, pro-innovation vision that came out, quarter century back.
Thank you for your work and spearheading a lot of this. Senator Sportner.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Mr. Wood, thank you so much for coming and giving a historical and high-level, broad overview of the energy markets here in Texas. Thank you for your service as well. You started with talking about how Governor Bush at the time appointed you, and your comment in the second paragraph was, Pat, our utilities care more about what the government thinks than what the customer thinks. That's wrong, and we're going to change that. Get us to a market. And then you added in your oral testimony that municipalities and co-ops were carved out for political reasons. In your written testimony, you say, much more politically correct, cooperatives and municipal-owned utilities were allowed to open their franchises on their own schedule. Then you finally sum it up, your last sentence is, I suggest that it's time to bring to benefits of competition to all Texans, not just those of us lucky enough to live in the ERCOT IOU service territory. So I think you're absolutely correct. The governance of MUOs and co-ops, they have a monopoly in their service region. And one way to have competition and making sure that inappropriate agreements are not opened up, or not negotiated and consummated by these entities is to have competition where they have a secondary, well, if I do this, what's it going to affect me if I have someone else competing against me? Is that something Texas should strive for the next 25 years? Is some form of competition in these areas that millions of Texans live in that allows for an energy market that is more competitive to benefit all consumers? And how do we get there? Do you have any?
Well, I think
politically,
it was politically correct to do that. I mean, it gave them the chance for the rest of the state to work out we've now done it for 20 years, and I think all the kinks are out of the system. Obviously the ERCOT issues at wholesale, everybody's benefiting from a wholesale market that works. And so the additional thing that has been deferred in those territories is the ability to shop at retail. And again, my experience with that is that has been additive to the savings we get from ERCOT working well. So it's time, and we've had 20 years to work that out. It was a good deal at the time. It allowed there to be a lot of focus on the things that mattered. The investor owners were kind of ready to move on from owning generation and get out into a new world. And I think it's been a generation now. It's always appropriate. Again, I'm kind of pro-liberty. I kind of tend to think we need to move that way because the world wants to collectivize and centralize a lot. I think it's best to push back, to do the kind of things that help customers. I just happen to have them in my family, people that own property in both a regulated area and a competitive area. And there are substantial price differences. But I should add, to be fair, the underlying wires charges in a rural area, and we learned this at Hunt when we bought Caprock Utility as part of Sherryland. When company in rural area has a much higher cents per kilowatt hour cost for the infrastructure than you would a urban Dallas or urban Houston. And we got to be honest about that. So when you bust that up and break it into a competitive rate and a regulated rate, that regulated rate's probably going to be higher if it's reflecting the underlying cost of the infrastructure. So munis, a little bit different answer than co-ops.
Senator Paxton.
Yes, and thank you so much, actually all of the panels, for your testimony here today. And I appreciate your insight and you bringing your institutional knowledge and experience to the committee today. On your last page of testimony, I thought this was interesting. Enabled by technology, demand response has finally come of age, and within 5 years, and you alluded to this on the slide, the ability of all sizes of customers on their iPhones talking to their smart appliances. And just an aside there, am I to understand that you remotely shut off the air conditioning on your wife? Is that correct? I'm sure there was a market-driven response to that.
Yeah, I'll say that's some kind of market, Senator.
Yes.
But when I signed up for that service, you're instructed to program at your own parameters. So I said when the price in the ERCOT market goes over $500 a megawatt hour, which is what, 50 cents kilowatt hour.
I bet it was more expensive than that for you.
It went way up. But the trigger was it basically shut the floor off. When you don't, fortunately, we're insulated. Now, if you didn't have a well-insulated house, it would be a little quicker than 3 hours. But no, I think, by and large, when you hear what Bill's talking about, 3 hours is longer. But that particular day was a long, hot day.
I bet it was for a couple of days, actually. Well, this is amazing, and I think part of what stood out to me was that you said this isn't far off in the future. This is near, and in particular, I was curious if you might say a little more about storage in particular, and this goes back to my question a little bit earlier, but just kind of a big picture of that, but also particularly how that's going to be impacting consumers, I think.
What's nice is, I think it's similar to a lot of the early adopters. The early adopters are paying for. People worry about we're going to have all this solar. It's going to leave, the poor part of Texas, holding the bill. But what's great is the opposite. Is a lot of this R&D and a lot of this benefits. So when he's putting a battery on the system, or I've got one in my garage, I'm helping solve Bill Magnus and Deanne's problem, which is to bring that peak down so we don't have that $9,000 price spike for much longer, or for a lesser time than it would be if nobody participated in really bringing discipline to the market. So again, we're doing that. We hope to make some money doing that. I avoid paying money by shutting off my appliances. He makes money by actually doing the arbitrage of buying low, selling high at the different locations across Texas. So those batteries then provide that discipline, again, that we never had. So you've got not only discipline from the customer, saying I'm going to adjust my demand in real time. Because, in the old days, we would consume as much power as we needed. We'd get a bill, and we'd pay it 30 days later. Well, if you've got, not everybody has to do this. If you got probably 10 or 15% of your resis, a lot of your commercials and all of your industrials doing that in demand response, that's way more discipline on the system than anybody in the world has. So if you have that combined with, on the supply side, the ability of this new device to look like a consumer for part of the time, look like a generator for part of the time, that just provides that balance, just like a level bubble would, just kind of going up and down. Those are two great big tools that we didn't have even 10 years ago.
Well, it's technology that is an incredible game changer.
Yes, ma'am. Absolutely.
Senator Nichols.
Thank you. I appreciated your comments a while ago on the rural co-ops have a different situation because of the sparseness of the customers and the extra amount of wiring and stuff. And I would also like to point out that those people in those rural areas probably would not even have electricity, was it not for those co-ops. Probably 80% or so of my district geographically is handled by co-ops. And so if this issue came up two sessions ago, it's comes up there, I started attending some of the stockholder meetings because the customers are the stockholders.
Correct.
In those things. And those co-ops are very sensitive to the moods of the customers, their stockholders. If they're not happy, there will be changes. And what I started out somewhat suspicious because of the monopoly situation, I'm probably more than half of my district geographically still does not have cell signal, and more than half of it still does not have broadband. And we're looking very heavily at the cooperation of a lot of these co-ops to be able to supply that if they are allowed to. And now we've taken some of the barriers down last session, and we're starting to see progress on that. But free market principles don't always work, is what I have learned, and it takes something kind of different to boost it and get it going. That doesn't mean that in some of the municipals, some really bad decisions are made on contractual stuff, which I've witnessed here in Austin, and there's zeal on the renewables. As an experience like the Southern company put in like an $800 million, $900 million biomass plant in my district, not too far from where I live, and it was great. They employed lots of people, building it, showed them timber every once in a while so they could burn the wood. But the cost for that generation was 3 or 4 times what anything else was. And finally, since it was take or pay, Austin was just writing a check every month. And so finally they just said, well, we'll just buy the plant so we don't have to make monthly payments, which is what they did. So that was a really bad decision. Maybe at the time with the information they had, it might have seemed like a good decision, but it was very bad. And the city can hide behind the city structure with other things. But the co-ops are different. I just wanted to point that out. Thanks.
Sure.
Senator Schwartner.
Yeah, I certainly agree with Senator Nichols. I have a lot of service area that's also served by co-ops, as well as 2 big MUOs in 2 of my largest cities. So it's interesting. But what you said there at the last with Austin Power, I have 160,000 residents there of Austin, and it's certainly unfortunate they have sometimes been inappropriately serviced by their power company. Thank you.
Before you go away, a couple of things. I want to piggyback on the battery. Are you familiar with the battery storage legislation that was passed last session through the Senate?
Yes, sir, I am. I read it.
Your thoughts on that?
I think it's appropriate to keep the utilities focused on the utility regulated business. In other words, stuff that the market wouldn't otherwise do. Which, when you think about, for example, the co-op example, the market can supply generation and retailers, but the market has not done a good job, even in the urban areas, providing wire services. So the rural areas were an extreme, but that was true for all of history. That's a natural monopoly, we call that.
Which was kind of our thought in crafting legislation is let's just keep this new technology out of the fully regulated portion of our market. Correct. So that it can develop based on market principles rather than government determining the value of a battery.
And because battery storage, and this has been attentions even when I was on the federal commission, which was 305, so this is very early years, but we had a couple of storage decisions come through there, and we ruled similar to the Texas Commission has done, which is not so fast. But if it's cheaper to do storage than it is to build a transmission line, because the way we pay for transmission in Texas, which some love and some hate, is we dump all the costs in one pot, we spread it like peanut butter across every customer in the state, and they pay the transmission share. That's worked pretty good to build a whole lot of transmission pretty quick, but in other words, that is a socialized cost. So if we're going to do that, and it's cheaper to do a battery, or to do some other sort of non-wires alternative, I'm going to keep it broad there, then we ought to not, just on pure economics, we ought to not be allergic to that. I think we ought to be careful, because what happens is if you create the incentive for a regulated company to be a little bit under the tent, do they just stay sniffing in the tent or want to take over the whole tent? I mean, history's not been real helpful to make that, to lead one to assume that that'll stay in the status quo that the bill has it. But we shouldn't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. And if it makes sense for utility to procure that service in a competitive environment, I mean, what was great ERCOT did in the old days is the Bill's predecessor, a man named Sam Jones, who ought to be on Mount Rushmore. He's that good. he said one of the things that he does to all the investors that are wanting to come into the state of Texas is he has PowerPoints. He had points on the ERCOT grid where it made the most sense electrically to put a power plant, and it had where it had access to water, had access to other, if it needed a railway for a coal plant or a pipeline for gas plant. These are the areas where it makes sense, where it would help us to do that. I mean, ideally, I'd love to see the distribution utilities kind of say, market, help us out here. And if the market, his company or mine or the others don't respond, maybe at that point you go forward and kind of do a different deal. But I think we ought to always err on the side of the market response being the answer, the first answer. And if it doesn't happen, be pragmatic enough, even though we're all free market types of some version or the other. Be pragmatic enough to admit that the market's failing here, as I think you do with rural broadband. I mean, it's failing. So let's not just sit there and do this. Let's look at a different solution. But I think that kind of 1-2 step approach on storage, which the bill seems to invite, seems to be the right answer. Kind of middle of the fairway that says this isn't going to be a big profit center for you, but if it's a customer benefiting investment, then it ought to be made, and all customers that benefit ought to pay for it.
Great, thank you. My final one too. You mentioned mini nuke, and I know that's something at the DOE federal level. There's a lot of discussion there. Frankly, there's been no discussion at the state level, which is, so I want you to go a little more into it and provide guidance of, is that something we need to be looking at? One of the things, and Mr. Nichols, I'm going to go back to the autonomous vehicles. One of my thoughts is I would rather have something in statute before something's developed than come to try to correct and fix mistakes after it's been developed. So looking ahead, if the state needs to do something on mini nuke guidance, I would rather do it before deployment than wait and see these things. And I'd rather be ahead of the curve than behind it. So help us.
I just see it as so far out. Honestly, I haven't put much intellectual wrap around on that one, Senator. I
don't have much to put around.
All right, we're in the same boat. I think it's still in the development phase. I think the legislature has time. I think obviously we've gotten away from, and I think it should be added, these wind and solar subsidies, which I agree are distorting to the market. They were helpful to jumpstart an infant industry, but the infant's growing a beard now. We need to kind of move on. They're ramped down under federal statute, and they should, unless they're changed, they should go to basically down in the next 2 or 3 years. So I would rather keep away from any sort of subsidy program for that, but it's probably as an infant industry to come. I could see that happening at the federal level. I wouldn't encourage Texas to get out ahead of that, if at all. And then, of course, the Nuclear Regulatory Agency would be probably the licensing permitting agency, considering that technology's always been a bit more elevated in security and in oversight than we had at the state level.
My final question for you is: we've seen plants shutter, right? Because of the market, really, coal's reduction, but all the components there to impact the system, the grid itself, are already in place.
Yes, sir. You mean the substation, the infrastructure, the wires that hook up to it? Yes, sir.
Do you see any incentive that we could provide specifically on baseload capacity? Because wind's going to go where wind is. Solar's going to go where the sun is. But I'm sitting there looking at all this infrastructure, and all the components there, that when it's shuttered, all of a sudden you've got a major investment that you're going to have to go duplicate someplace else. Any suggestions on incentivizing? My initial easy thought is expedite the regulatory approval process, because
and again, one of the things we did get out of in '95 was having at least the PUC and be involved in those. Right now, there are environmental issues with regard to coal plant cleanups that I know with the strip mines, the Railroad Commission oversees the remediation of that. And
right.
Done pretty fine on that, but I think the permitting, if you're the retrofits that I have seen that come to mind when you asked your question, that are mostly outside of Texas are where utilities, mostly in the regulated part of the world, in the southeast, for example, are converting coal plants to a gas plant.
Right.
You do have to change out equipment, but a lot of the back end stuff looks
ancillary stuff there.
Looks good. So it's not a start from zero cost equation. Of course, because of their low cost, the future is going to be renewables, and so they're going to build near where the fuel is. So where the sunny spots and the windy spots are,
right.
which is the CREDS legislation anticipated. And so, and when I think about the Rockdale plant, for example, that was one of the first coal plants I ever got to see. It was long ago. Think about that shutting down. It's emotional. I mean, you think about these things, but again, I'm a big advocate for letting the market work and where we're going in the future. So I'm torn between my two psychologies in my brain. But I think that investment there, the owner of that plant's got a pretty strong financial incentive to try to optimize what, in that case, it was, I think it was Vistra who owned that plant, the company Dynegy merged with. They've got an asset there. That asset's in a great part of the grid. The economics aren't real attractive today for natural gas, but again, look how things have changed over just 30 years. We've all been probably out of college, so it's been, that variety of market impulses. I would say they've got a valuable asset. It may not be monetizable today, to answer your question, but I think those things just don't rust and go apart. I mean, the owners of that plant will do something with it. They may decide to turn it into a strip mall or shopping center, but I mean, there's some need for that land, and land always has value. So, I mean, I wish I had a better answer for you, but again, all I've seen is coal to gas conversions,
right.
And gas is not getting a price signal here in Texas. You heard that from Deanne and Bill. But that's not to say it won't happen tomorrow. And if you had it tomorrow, that'd be where you would obviously want to build on a brownfield site.
Yeah, I was just curious. Infrastructure's there, and we're not using it. Is there a way to utilize those assets? So, Senator Sportner, did you have?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. One last question. This is kind of to Senator Zaffarini's question about traveling from Laredo to Dallas and the EV, and maybe Mr. Rose or Mr. Wood can answer it. And these charging stations now seem to be primarily either in areas that are government-owned or private industry. But looking forward into the future with the potential exponential growth of EVs in Texas, who should regulate charging stations? Right now, gas stations are Department of Agriculture. Should we incentivize the growth somehow at the state level of charging stations? Or should it all just be done in a private industry way, some sort of competitive manner? Does anyone have any thoughts on that?
I've got some general thoughts at this stage. I'm still researching that to determine the exact answer and recommendations, which we're working on this year. But my general idea is I would leave the competitive market to put those in as much as possible. You may need to do, regulation of the metering to make sure that they're not, charging less and charging the customer more than they're putting into the vehicle. But outside that, I would leave them pretty open to do that. The cost of that infrastructure is not cheap. So that filling station that puts in, they're going to have to charge more than the homeowner does or the commercial building does for that electricity to pay for that cost.
Should we regulate them like a retailer? Or?
I don't think so. I think it's like another, and you're just changing hoses to wires, in my opinion.
But they store it somehow on site. They could goose the market a little bit.
If you could store it, most of them are hooked into the grid where they're provided. They're basically changing electricity that can't be used in a car to electricity that can be used in a car. Okay, so they're converting and they're having to pay for that conversion process in that process.
So they could do that in the middle of the night and charge
if they have storage. Now, most of them don't have storage yet. Now, if you've got a small wire going to that building, okay, and you don't want to pay the utility to upgrade the wire, then you can put in storage. But right now, I'm seeing the economics of that being too expensive. I mean, it's expensive enough to put in a $50,000 or $100,000 DC fast charger, okay, and they're going to have to get money, so they're going to charge you more for the convenience of charging on the road instead of charging at home. You're going to always be cheaper charging at home than charging on the road.
And cheaper is like 2.5 cents a mile. I mean, if that 7.5 cent rate I'm paying, and I do charge at night when it's usually, actually I charged 2 nights ago, and the wind subsidy was so deep I was paid $1.50 from the Texas energy market to charge my car. Love that. All right, that was a very unusual night, but you want to charge at the right times when you're thinking about the issues from the first panel about summer demand with the issues from our panel and the one right before us. There's a lot going on here, so you want to always have everything based on a price signal. 2.5 cents to drive a mile in an EV compared to 15 cents a mile for my Suburban. It's hard. It's just hard to fight the fight that I hear from some of my more hydrocarbon-based friends that this isn't coming. This is coming. It's coming, and when you get the cost of the car down from the overpriced one I bought to the ones that people are paying now, it's over. So I mean, we do have to prepare for it. It is imminent. It's much more imminent than I think we thought. But
right now, does PUC or Department of Ag, they regulate these charging stations at all?
There's no
regulation of
ag sticker on that.
I didn't think so. No.
Not at this point.
There's not one with a gas pump anymore either.
Yeah, we took those off, didn't we?
I will add that some EV providers, as an incentive to buy their vehicle,
right,
are letting you charge for free or very little cost, and so allowing as long as there's competition amongst the charging.
Neither one of y'all think the state of Texas should be putting in state of Texas owned charging stations up and down highways.
For the state of Texas fleet, do it like FedEx, do it like the Postal Service, great. Do it for your own uses, or the city does it for its own city vehicles. No problem with that. But you know, don't put it in utility rate base either. Do it as a separate, so that let the users who are paying 2.5 cents a mile to drive, let them cover the cost of their own power. That should not be subsidized by anybody because it's already a great deal going forward.
It's going to be interesting over the next 10 years, isn't it?
All we know with the federal subsidies is every time they're supposed to wear out, they keep going.
Yeah.
I think the EV one is going though. I think if you buy a new,
Yeah. All right. Thank you, panel.